I'm David Sable. Welcome to the video edition of my LinkedIn newsletter, Imagine, where we challenge the status quo by asking questions. And it's my belief that the more questions we ask, the better the answers. So join me on my quest. Today, I want to talk about shattering conventional wisdom. How do we take what people believe, how do we take conventional wisdom and just take a hammer to it and really not just change the status quo, but maybe change the world? So we're going to talk about three things: disruption, purpose, and leadership, one of my favorite topics. Let's start with disruption. It's my belief that this morning's disruption is this afternoon's conventional wisdom. So what we think is so cool and crazy and disruptive today, tomorrow just becomes the way we think. And then we look to disrupt that again. And I'm just not sure that that gets us to the best place. So remember that today's disruption becomes tonight's conventional wisdom. So I always ask, what do we think is being disrupted? Did WeWork disrupt the worker? In fact, WeWork basically disrupted most of their investors. Does Uber disrupt the rider, or does it just give you a better ride? It definitely disrupted many things like financial markets. It definitely disrupted the drivers and their lifestyle. But from your point of view, those of us who use it, didn't disrupt me. Does Warby Parker disrupt the wearer? Don't think so. And finally, does Amazon disrupt the buyer? So I think disruption is really critical in understanding what is it we're talking about disrupting when we talk about that. So here's today's reality, right? This is from the Financial Times. Even the management consultants who are at the heart of the cult of disruption struggle to define it. Imagine that. Management consultants struggling to define anything. What is viewed as disruption is often plain old luck, and no self-styled disruption consultant can engineer or predict that. Or this from Vanity Fair. San Francisco tech culture is focused on solving one problem. What is my mother no longer doing for me? Or as I say, how do I get pizza delivered quicker? And finally from Inc., disruption isn't always the answer. It's only half of the puzzle. The other half is a non-disruptive creation that is based on value. So what I would say, because I think the Inc. one is the closest to the truth, is very simple. Disruption is the half of the puzzle that relates to financial markets, but the other half is the value that's given to you as the consumer. So let's take a look at a couple of interesting disruption possibilities. So first, I love this story about the Dabbawalas in Mumbai. I suggest you Google or Bing, to be fair to Microsoft, search the Dabbawalas. It's such an interesting story. It's beyond people who deliver lunch from long distances to the city, to people's factories, to where they work, and they're hot and they're fresh, because the food in the factories is pretty crappy. And they do it all with little colored pieces of paper. It's amazing. They're algorithms, actually, if you think about it, but they're little pieces of colored paper. And so rather than find a way to disrupt what they did, because it was pretty impossible, because they drive bicycles, they got them e-bikes. Like, think about that. That's the value part of the equation. It's brilliant. Think about it. How about this disruption, right? I don't have to go past this. I think the disruption of WeWork has been proven is a bit of a pyramid scheme. It's pretty damning when you think about the whole story. And I think the worst is, and I love WeWork. I thought it was great. Right now, they've got a bigger problem, which is how do you socially distance in a space that was meant not to be. So not only did it prove to be not as disruptive as we thought, but I think that even going forward, it's going to be a big problem. And finally, Elizabeth Holmes, one of the ultimate stories of disruptions, who was finally disrupted herself in what turned out to be one big fraud. So the way I look at it is disruptors talk to themselves. It's a great story. I'm disrupting the market. I'm disrupting this. I'm disrupting that. What you need to do as people who are thinking about how do you bring that second half, the value half, to the market, how do you talk to people? Because that's what you need to do. So the way I look at it, if you really want to be disruptive, brands can be disrupted simply by channeling the customer. Stop talking about omni-channel because you think that you're disrupting. Talk about the omni-consumer, the omni-customer, because that will bring you to true value. And just to give you two more proof points, because I think they're kind of important. How do I know this? Why do I believe this as much as I do? Because the ultimate disruptor, Jeff Bezos, doesn't talk about himself in those terms. Jeff said, if we can keep our competitors focused on us while we stay focused on the customer, ultimately we'll turn out all right. And so here's the guy who opens up stores when everybody else is saying all stores are dead. Here's the guy who does more about delivery when others aren't thinking about it, and who looks for the best customer service. So I think about it. Jeff Bezos talks about the customer. So now let's look at Alibaba and Jack Ma, who, by the way, if you read as much about Jack Ma as I do, you'll know that Jack Ma says he learned everything that he knows here. So Jeff Ma says, if I were you, I'd focus on customers. I'd not focus on making money. I'd focus on making values. So think about what Inc. said. The second half is, you want to really disrupt? Think about the value that you bring. That's what Jack Ma is saying. If you think about value, you ultimately deliver money. So part of this whole notion of disruption is looking at demographics. And frankly, traditional demographics, conventional wisdoms are completely misunderstood. So the first is, let's talk about boomers. Now, obviously, as you can see, I have a bit of a bias, but boomers still have enormous spending power. And we rarely talk about them. We constantly put boomers down. Not me, but many of you. So boomers control 70% of the country's disposable income. Think about that. And somebody who said, the New York Times wrote a great story, while millennials are sharing, boomers are buying. So don't overlook me. And so we overlook, but the truth is that we overlook these people. And we consistently overlook them. They have huge buying power. They have huge power to buy and give. And by the way, many of them are buying for the millennial children. So don't ever overlook that, because I can't think of anything more important. And millennials aren't the only demographic. And, the independent retailer said marketers have gotten so hot for the millennial generation that they've essentially ignored boomers. That's true. But people are also ignoring Gen Z. You hear it more and more, but you don't hear it enough. And they should not be underestimated, because I think the Gen Z, the generation coming up behind them, have tremendous buying power, because very often they're getting money from the boomers and from the millennials to spend, or things are being handed down to them, allowing them to buy more, or to upgrade, or to modernize, or whatever the case may be. Do not overlook Gen Z and the people coming behind them. But I will say, here's my biggest problem. So even if you don't agree with me about boomers, if you don't agree with me about millennials, if you don't agree with me about Gen Z, here's one thing that I think is fact and is not just my opinion. So every generation looks at the generation coming behind it and says the same thing. Listen, this is Hesiod, 8th century BC. I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on frivolous youth of today, for certainly all youth are reckless beyond words. This could be a headline in any news article today. It's not new, one generation looking down on the other, or one generation looking up, and in looking up, looking down. This is not new. We're not in a new place. So just remember that when you think about where the money's going to come next. So let's talk about purpose. Purpose is another one of those words that's way overused. Purposeful behavior, purposeful companies, purposeful brands, way overused and incredibly misunderstood. I'll just quote Lawrence Fink of BlackRock, because he's written a lot about this. And so here's his view. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. So this is the same company that talks about how you have to be green and sustainable, and yet invests an incredible amount of oil, because that's how they return big money to their investors. We won't talk about that. And then, from this study from Porter Novelli, more than 3/4 of Americans believe it is no longer acceptable for companies to just make money. They expect companies to positively impact society as well. So, is that true? Well, let's take a look. So let's look first at corporate statements of purpose. So I've ranked them from the loftiest to the most functional. So lofty being JetBlue, for example, to inspire humanity, both in the air and on the ground. Now I got to tell you, I love JetBlue. I fly JetBlue whenever I can, but I don't know, was I inspired on the air and the ground? I got a good seat. I paid an extra $15 and I sat in the front, but inspire humanity both in the air and the ground? I don't know. Is that truly a purposeful statement? Or let's look at the most functional, Google, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Now that, to me, is smart. It's true. I get it. It's not over-promising. It's not under-promising. It's making its purpose clear, but it's making its purposefulness up to you. So you get what they're going to do. Is it good or bad? Is it the right thing? I think that's something that you have to think about and that you have to make work. Or if we'll take one in the middle, Facebook, to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. I don't know about you. Right now, I'd argue that Facebook is probably driving the world apart in many critical ways. Not on purpose, just by fact of who they are. So when you think about your statement of purpose, use this as a benchmark. Look at the loftiest, look at the most functional, and then think about where do you fit and take it apart, much like I did. And so, yet, despite the fact that we believe that this is important, and BlackRock tells us that we can't be real companies unless we're good, Indra, who recently left Pepsi, was told, don't be Mother Teresa. Your job is to sell soda and chips. So when she was CEO and trying to do good things, this is what the investors told her. Paul Pullman, one of the great CEOs, in my view, of the last 15 years, Pullman's problem is his eagerness to put superficial feel-good policies ahead of sound business decisions. So here's a guy who delivered quarter over quarter over quarter over quarter better earnings, but they weren't good enough because many investors felt they could have been higher if he hadn't put superficial feel-good policies ahead of sound business decisions. So you tell me. Here's another one. Sometimes brands can make the mistake of trying to take a stance on a bunch of different things that at some point you're like, well, do I really care what a toilet paper brand thinks about this specific issue? So I think that's also part of it. Do you really care? Like, do you care that your brand is purposeful? Or is it being purposeful about the right things? I think that's the question. Are we being purposeful about the right things? Here's just one example, and I can give you many. Let's look at Uber. So here's Uber. 103 Uber drivers in the U.S. have been accused of sexually assaulting or abusing their passengers in the past 4 years. So that's one side of it. Uber drivers, because there was no regulation, nobody was really paying attention, were out of control. I will add to it that Uber drivers are often and mostly underpaid, overworked. They have no safety net. And yet, 4 months after that article, trips are up 35%, gross bookings up 37%, and the company just continues to grow and grow. So people like you and me, and I'm guilty here, if I would ask, are you purposeful? And you'd raise your hand and say yes. And then I'd ask you, do you use Uber? And you'd probably say yes. And then I have to question how truly purposeful you really are. So bottom line, trust with purpose can still drive value, but it has to be more compelling than convenience and price. So if you can create trust with purpose and drive value with it, remember that word value, we talked about that before in terms of disruption. It's good, it could be great, but it has to be better than great. It has to be more compelling than compelling, because convenience and price is still driving way, way too much. So let's talk a little bit about leadership, one of my favorite topics, and a number of my newsletters and one of my video newsletters was all about leadership. But people perceive that there's a leadership crisis in the world today. Duh. So business decision makers, citizen leaders, millennials, over 80% of all believe that there's a leadership crisis. And I think it's sort of obvious, right? Interestingly enough, that leads people to trust companies more than government to take care of their needs. So over 61% agree that private companies are necessary today to solve problems. So now think about what it means to be purposeful, but then think about what it means when people are counting on you to solve problems that government isn't. So it's not just being about purposeful, saying nice things in your communications or sending out good social messaging. It means they expect you to solve their problems. And there's one thing, though, that we know for sure, that's leadership and power are way too often conflated in today's world. So if you're big, if you're the tech giant, if you're the highest paid person, we think somehow that we need to look to you for leadership. And then when you don't lead us, we wonder what's going on. It causes tremendous, tremendous dissonance. But that's because we conflate it. And as we know, here's what leaders are, and I've talked about this. Leaders aren't appointed because I call you God, you're not. Because you're higher up on the chart than me or lower on the chart than me, it doesn't mean that you are the leader or you're not the leader. You might be the leader and you might be way down on the org chart. Leaders don't get the biggest salary. That doesn't make you the leader. It just means you make more money. If you're wearing the crown, does that mean you're the leader? No, it just means you're king, and it's good to be king, as Mel Brooks said in a movie, but it doesn't make you the leader. If you're the loudest, just means you're the most obnoxious. And if you're the meanest, it means you're the meanest. It doesn't mean you're the leader. Let's not confuse these things. But I will tell you, leadership is about humility, again, listening and openness. And this is a picture of myself with the Pope. I had the incredible experience of spending an hour with him in a private meeting with 3 friends. And I can tell you that the experience was life-changing for me. You can read the piece that I wrote about it. It's also on LinkedIn. The humility of this man who walked into the room on time, without an entourage, no device in his hand, and sat and listened and focused on us for an hour, was a lesson in leadership, the like of which I've never had in my life. Leaders are always in beta. This is something that's really important to me. I don't think leadership can be taught. I think leadership happens, you have it in you, and need brings it to the forefront. And part of that is because true leaders are always improvising. They're always in beta because you never know what's going to happen. So I've given you a couple of examples here, but Moses or Lincoln or Winston Churchill or soldiers in war. Constant change, constant pivoting. No book written how to handle a world war like that, a civil war. Plagues. There's just nothing. But they're in beta and they rise to the occasion. They make it work. So a few favorite quotes. My readers and listeners know that I love quotes. Da Vinci, nothing strengthens authority so much as silence. Listening. Nothing is better. A leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. And that's the key. Shows the way. Knowing the way and going the way is great, but it's not enough. You need to be leading the pack. You need to be showing the way. And finally, the one that I think is absolutely the bottom line for true leadership. The challenge of leadership is to be strong, but not rude. Think about that. Be kind, but not weak. Be bold, but not a bully. Be thoughtful, but not lazy. Be humble, but not timid. Be proud, but not arrogant. Have humor, but without folly. Frankly, that is one of the most important quotes about leadership that I know. So, I leave it to you. What do you think? Let me know. I'd love to hear. And thank you for joining me on my Imagine newsletter.